A priceless black granite slab, the Rosetta Stone, brought the breakthrough in deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Over 2 centuries,
The writing had puzzled scholars for centuries, but the young linguist was up for the challenge. Until then, scholars had been stumped by the Egyptian symbols.
Imagine a single stone, hidden behind glass in the British Museum, holding a secret the world thought it had already solved. 1,700 pounds of dark grey rock, carved in 3 scripts, that gave humanity the key to Egyptian hieroglyphs, or so we thought. For over 2,000 years, the Rosetta Stone was celebrated as a triumph of discovery. But now, with the power of artificial intelligence, researchers are uncovering a darker truth. This isn't just a royal decree, it may be the world's first political masterstroke. A message of manipulation, control, and propaganda, hiding in plain sight. What if everything we knew about it was wrong? Rosetta Stone discovery. The year is 1799. Napoleon Bonaparte, who at this point is not yet the Emperor of France, but is very much the most ambitious general in the country, and has launched a military campaign into Egypt.
In 1799, as the French military invaded Egypt, an officer encountered a curious stone on the outskirts of Rashid, or Rosetta. It was inscribed with 3 different portions of text.
The strategic goal is to disrupt British trade routes to India. The cultural goal, because Napoleon understood the power of legacy in a way that most military commanders did not, is to uncover the mysteries of ancient Egypt and bring them back to Europe. He brought soldiers. He also brought scholars. Over 150 scientists, engineers, linguists, and artists sailed with the French army to Egypt, and their mission was to document everything they found. It was a military invasion that doubled as the largest archaeological expedition the world had ever seen. In July of that year, a group of French soldiers under the command of Captain Pierre-François Bouchard were strengthening the defenses of Fort Julien near the town of Rashid, which the French called Rosetta, in the Nile Delta. While digging foundations for an extension of the fort, one of the soldiers struck something solid buried in the ground. When they pulled it out and cleaned it off, they found themselves staring at a large slab of granodiorite, a dark, dense stone covered in carved text. 3 distinct blocks of writing, clearly different scripts, arranged one above the other on the same surface. The top section was Egyptian hieroglyphics, the sacred script of ancient Egypt that nobody alive in 1799 could read. The middle section was Demotic, a later form of Egyptian writing used for everyday documents. And the bottom section was Ancient Greek, which European scholars could read fluently. The significance was recognized almost immediately. If this stone carried the same message written in 3 different scripts, and one of those scripts was readable, and then it could potentially be used as a key to unlock the other 2. It was, in the most literal sense, a decoder ring carved in stone. Napoleon's scholars knew what they had. The stone was transported to Cairo for study, and copies of the inscriptions were made and distributed to researchers across Europe. But before the French could fully capitalize on their discovery, the British Navy defeated Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of the Nile. And when the French eventually surrendered Egypt in 1801, the stone was handed over to the British as part of the terms of capitulation. It arrived in London in 1802 and has been in the British Museum ever since. And the race to decode it, the race that would consume the next 2 decades of linguistic scholarship in Europe, had already begun. Champollion deciphers, hieroglyphs. Now imagine being a young man in early 19th century France, growing up in a world where the monuments of ancient Egypt are the greatest unsolved mystery in the Western world. The pyramids, the temples of Luxor and Karnak.
3 kilometers long, the Avenue of Rams connects the temples of Luxor and Karnak with the 3,500-year-old sphinxes.
Walls and obelisks covered in thousands of years of carved symbols that nobody can read. An entire civilization's written history sealed behind a script that looks more like art than language, and every serious scholar in Europe is racing to be the first to crack it open. That is the world Jean-François Champollion was born into, and by every account, he was the kind of person that world was waiting for. Champollion was a prodigy. He began studying ancient languages as a child, and by his teenage years had already mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Chaldean, Oz, and Coptic. the last surviving descendant of the ancient Egyptian language. That last one turned out to be the crucial piece, because while other scholars were treating hieroglyphics as purely symbolic, as pictures that represented ideas rather than sounds, Champollion had a different theory. He believed, based on his deep knowledge of Coptic, that at least some hieroglyphs represented phonetic sounds, actual spoken language encoded in visual symbols. And on September 14, 1822, working with copies of the Rosetta Stone and inscriptions from other Egyptian monuments, he proved he was right. The breakthrough came when Champollion realized that the hieroglyphic cartouches, those oval-shaped enclosures that appear throughout Egyptian texts, contained the phonetic spellings of royal names. By cross-referencing the Greek text on the Rosetta Stone, which mentioned Ptolemy, with the hieroglyphic cartouches, he was able to assign sound values to specific symbols. And once he had those anchor points, the entire system began to unravel. Hieroglyphics were not just pictures. They were a sophisticated writing system that combined phonetic, logographic, and determinative elements. And Champollion, at the age of 31, had figured out how to read them. The announcement electrified the scholarly world. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, human beings could read the words that ancient Egyptians had carved into their temples, their tombs, and their monuments. An entire civilization's voice, silenced since the fall of Rome, was speaking again. And the Rosetta Stone itself. The translation was straightforward. It was a decree issued by a council of priests assembled at Memphis in 196 BC. The decree affirmed the divine status of the young pharaoh Ptolemy V Epiphanes, listed his benefactions to the temples and the people of Egypt, and established a cult in his honor. It was carved in 3 scripts so that it could be read by the priesthood, by the literate public, and by the Greek-speaking ruling class. A religious and political document. Important, certainly, but not particularly mysterious once you could read the words. And for the next 2 centuries, that was the accepted story. The words had been decoded, the message was understood, there was nothing more to find. Or so everyone thought. AI decodes history. Fast forward to the 2020s. In basement labs and high-security research wings at institutions like the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, University College London, Google DeepMind's Cultural Heritage Division, and the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin, something extraordinary is happening at the intersection of ancient history and cutting-edge technology. And most of the world has no idea it is going on. Researchers specializing in computational linguistics and machine learning, people who split their careers between ancient languages and Python code.
The Rosetta Stone helped illuminate one of the world's oldest written languages and the vibrant history it emerged from.
Are building AI systems designed to analyze ancient texts in a way that no human translator has ever been capable of. Not word by word, not sentence by sentence, but at a level of simultaneous, a large-scale pattern recognition that the human brain simply cannot perform, no matter how brilliant the scholar or how many decades they dedicate to the work. These are not chatbots. These are not the AI tools you use to write an email or generate an image. These are purpose-built machine learning models trained on vast corpora of ancient texts. Thousands and thousands of documents spanning centuries of Egyptian, Greek, Mesopotamian, and Roman administrative, religious, and political writing. Systems like Google DeepMind's model that successfully restored damaged ancient Greek inscriptions in 2022, a project called Ithaca that was published in Nature and stunned the classical studies world by outperforming human epigraphers at predicting missing text on broken stone tablets. Or the work coming out of MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, where researchers have built models capable of automatically deciphering lost languages by identifying underlying structural patterns that connect related writing systems across time. These tools can process an entire civilization's surviving written output simultaneously. They can identify recurring linguistic structures that appear across centuries of documents. They can detect subtle shifts in word choice, phrasing, and rhetorical strategy that would take a single human scholar an entire career to catalog manually. And here is the part that matters most. They can do all of this without the cultural biases, the institutional assumptions, and the interpretive blind spots that every human reader inevitably brings to the table, no matter how careful or how experienced they are. Think about that for a moment. When Champollion decoded the Rosetta Stone in 1822, he was a genius, working essentially alone with incredibly limited resources. A handful of copied inscriptions, his hard-won knowledge of Coptic, his own remarkable linguistic intuition, and that was enough to crack the code of the script itself, to figure out that hieroglyphics were not just symbolic pictures, but a sophisticated system encoding actual phonetic language. That achievement remains one of the great intellectual triumphs in human history, and nothing about what AI is doing now diminishes it in the slightest. But here is what Champollion could not do, what no single human being can do. He could not simultaneously compare the Rosetta Stone's specific word choices against every other surviving Ptolemaic-era decree. He could not run statistical analyses on the frequency and distribution of emotionally charged phrasing versus neutral administrative language across centuries of comparable documents. He could not map the rhetorical architecture of the text and measure it quantitatively against known frameworks of political persuasion from the ancient world.
When the British military defeated the French in Egypt, the Rosetta Stone and other artifacts were granted to England in an 1801 surrender treaty.
He cracked the code of the script. He figured out how to read the words. But understanding what those words actually mean in their full historical, political, and rhetorical context is a completely different problem. Because language is never just vocabulary and grammar. Language is strategy. Language is persuasion. Language is power. And the people who carved the Rosetta Stone were not writing a neutral record of events. They were crafting a document designed to be read, to be believed, and to accomplish a very specific political objective in a very specific moment of crisis. The question that nobody seriously asked for 200 years is the question that AI is now forcing us to confront. What if we decoded the words perfectly, but completely missed the message? Several research teams have begun applying natural language processing and transformer-based machine learning models to the Rosetta Stone and other Ptolemaic-era decrees from the same period. What these systems do is take the linguistic patterns found in the Rosetta Stone and compare them against a massive corpus of other ancient Egyptian administrative, religious, and political texts spanning centuries of documented governance. They look for anomalies. They identify phrases and grammatical constructions that deviate from the standard bureaucratic language found in comparable decrees issued during more stable periods of Ptolemaic rule. They flag specific word choices that carry emotional weight, persuasive intensity, or rhetorical urgency beyond what their literal translations suggest. And they map the structural architecture of the entire document, paragraph by paragraph, clause by clause, to identify techniques of emphasis, repetition, strategic ordering, and deliberate framing that serve a persuasive purpose rather than a purely informational one. In short, these AI systems are reading the Rosetta Stone not merely as a text to be translated, but as a piece of strategic communication engineered to influence the beliefs and behaviors of every person who encountered it. And the patterns they are finding beneath the surface of that familiar 2,000-year-old decree are genuinely remarkable. The kind of remarkable that makes you rethink whether the most famous artifact in archaeology has been telling us the whole truth, or whether it has been telling us exactly what someone needed us to hear. The hidden message. To understand what the AI analysis is revealing, you need to understand the political situation in Egypt in 196 BC, because the context changes everything. Ptolemy V Epiphanes became pharaoh when he was 5 years old. His father, Ptolemy IV, had been a weak and increasingly unpopular ruler whose reign was marked by corruption, palace intrigue, and the beginning of serious internal rebellion. When Ptolemy IV died, the court officials who took control of the regency murdered the young king's mother, Arsinoe III, who had been a popular and respected figure in Egypt. The country was in crisis. Upper Egypt was in open revolt. Native Egyptian populations who had been ruled by the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic dynasty for over a century were rising up. The legitimacy of the dynasty itself was being questioned in ways it had never been questioned before. Now imagine standing in the halls of power in Memphis with all of that happening around you. You are a priest or a court official, or a Greek administrator trying to hold together an empire that is fracturing from the inside out. You have a child pharaoh on the throne with no real authority. You have a murdered queen. And you have rebellions in the south. And you need the people of Egypt, the native Egyptian population, and the Greek ruling class, and the priestly establishment to believe that everything is fine, that the young king is legitimate, that the gods favor him, that his rule is righteous and his dynasty is secure. You need propaganda. And not just any propaganda. You need a document that feels like a religious decree, that reads like an act of devotion, but that functions as a carefully engineered piece of political messaging designed to shore up a crumbling regime. That, according to the AI analysis, is exactly what the Rosetta Stone is. The machine learning models.
British Museum every year. The Egyptian collection is a huge draw, and one of the biggest attractions, the Rosetta Stone.
Have identified several layers of rhetorical strategy embedded in the text that go far beyond a simple priestly decree. First, the language used to describe Ptolemy the Fifth's benefactions is not the standard administrative phrasing found in comparable decrees from more stable periods. It is amplified. The word choices carry stronger emotional connotations. The praise is more effusive, more insistent, more deliberately constructed to create an impression of extraordinary generosity and divine favor. The AI models flag these deviations because they appear in the Rosetta Stone at a statistically higher frequency than in similar decrees from periods when the Ptolemaic dynasty was secure and unchallenged. In other words, the text is trying too hard. It is overcompensating, and that overcompensation is a detectable signal that points to a document written not from a position of strength, but from a position of deep political anxiety. Second, the decree's emphasis on tax reductions, prisoner releases, and temple restorations follows a pattern that the AI models identify as a legitimation strategy, a specific rhetorical framework used by rulers throughout the ancient world who needed to win popular support quickly. These are not random acts of royal generosity. They are calculated concessions designed to buy loyalty from specific power bases, the priesthood, the military, the general population, at a moment when that loyalty was genuinely in doubt. The Rosetta Stone, viewed through this lens, is not a celebration of a beloved king. It is a desperate attempt to manufacture the appearance of a beloved king using every rhetorical tool available to the people who wrote it. And the fact that it was carved in 3 scripts was not just about accessibility, it was about reach. It was about making sure this message of legitimacy penetrated every literate community in Egypt simultaneously. The priests who could read hieroglyphics, the bureaucrats who read demotic, the Greek administrators who held actual political power. Everyone needed to receive the same carefully constructed narrative at the same time. Hidden historical bias. Now here is the question that keeps researchers up at night. And honestly, once you hear it, it might keep you up too. If the most famous artifact in archaeology, the single object that every history student in the world learns about before they even finish secondary school, has been carrying a hidden layer of political manipulation beneath its surface for over 2,000 years, and it took artificial intelligence to detect it, then what else have we missed?
But what was found here, with the help of artificial intelligence, could change the way we understand history.
What other ancient texts are sitting in museum display cases and university archive rooms right now? Texts we believe we fully understand, carrying messages and meanings and deliberate manipulations that our human reading of them has simply never been equipped to detect. Because the Rosetta Stone is not some obscure tablet pulled from a forgotten storeroom. It is the most studied, most translated, most written about artifact in the history of archaeology. Thousands of scholars across 2 centuries have examined it, and none of them caught what a machine learning model flagged in its first comprehensive analysis. Think about what that means for everything else. The implications are staggering, and they extend far beyond Egypt and far beyond the Ptolemaic period. Every ancient civilization that left behind written records also left behind the biases, the agendas, and the political calculations of the people who created those records. The victors write the history. We have always known that as a proverb, as an abstract idea we nod along to in classrooms. But what AI is now making possible is the ability to actually detect the fingerprints of that process embedded in the texts themselves, not by guessing, not by theorizing from a position of modern bias, but by identifying measurable, quantifiable linguistic patterns that distinguish neutral administrative record-keeping from deliberate political persuasion. Imagine applying this kind of analysis to the royal inscriptions of Assyrian kings like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, rulers who carved elaborate, boastful accounts of their military conquests into the stone walls of palaces at Nineveh and Nimrud. Historians have long suspected that these inscriptions exaggerate victories and omit defeats, but suspecting is not the same as proving. AI models trained on the full corpus of Assyrian administrative texts could potentially identify exactly where the rhetorical inflation begins, which specific phrases deviate from standard military reporting language, and which structural patterns match known propaganda frameworks rather than factual accounts. Now imagine running those same models on Roman imperial decrees issued during periods of civil war and contested succession. Documents that were carved into public monuments specifically to control the narrative around who held legitimate power and why. Or on medieval European chronicles written by monks whose monasteries depended on the patronage of the very kings whose histories they were recording. Or on the Behistun inscription in Iran, where Darius the Great carved a massive trilingual account of how he came to power into a cliff face 300 feet above the ground, a text that historians have debated for over a century because the version of events Darius tells does not fully align with other surviving sources from the same period. Every single one of those texts was written by a human being with something at stake, and every single one of them contains choices, word choices, structural choices, rhetorical choices, that reveal something about that agenda if you have a tool sensitive enough to see the patterns that human cognition alone cannot process at scale. Researchers working on these AI models are quick to point out, and I think this distinction is important, that the technology does not replace human scholarship. It augments it. The AI cannot tell you why a particular phrase was chosen over a more neutral alternative. It cannot reconstruct the conversations that happened behind closed doors in the court at Memphis before the decree was carved. It cannot feel the fear and political desperation that a collapsing dynasty would have generated among the advisors trying to hold the regime together. Those interpretations require human knowledge, human historical context, and human empathy. What the AI does is point human scholars toward the right questions they did not know to ask. It flags a phrase and says, this construction is statistically unusual for this type of document in this period. It identifies a rhetorical pattern and says this matches known legitimation strategies from other eras of political instability. It maps a structural choice and says this serves a persuasive function rather than an informational one. And then the human scholars, armed with that data, can return to the historical record and start pulling threads that nobody realized were there. That is the real revolution here. Not that AI is smarter than Champollion. It is not. What Champollion accomplished in 1822, with nothing but his own mind and a knowledge of Coptic, remains one of the most extraordinary intellectual achievements in human history. And nothing happening in these labs diminishes that. The revolution is that AI can perceive things that human cognition is simply not wired to detect on its own. Patterns distributed across thousands of documents. Statistical deviations in word frequency that only become visible when you process an entire civilization's written output simultaneously. Rhetorical architectures that are completely invisible at the sentence level, but emerge with startling clarity when you analyze an entire corpus at scale. We decoded the Rosetta Stone 200 years ago. We read every word. We understood the grammar. We translated every sentence and published it in textbooks that students still study today. But we may have been reading the surface of a document that was engineered, from the very first chisel stroke, to make us believe exactly what someone in a crumbling palace needed us to believe. And it worked. For 2,000 years, without interruption, it worked. So here we are, standing before a stone that has spoken for over 2 millennia, yet is only now revealing the whispers beneath its words. What if everything we thought we knew about history is only the version someone wanted us to hear? How many other voices hidden in plain sight are waiting for the right key, the right perspective to be understood? The Rosetta Stone may have given us the words, but the real story is only beginning to unfold. And when it does, will we recognize the truth that has been quietly shaping our world all along?